welcome. I'm Dr. Troy Waddell, the Coordinator of Career Readiness for the Downingtown Area School District. This is our Career Cafe program today, designed to provide you with an insight into a really unique aspect of the healthcare industry. We have with us today as our special guest, the Vice President of Finance, Mergers and Acquisitions. I think I got the title right.
You did.
Kyle Schmidt. Kyle and I met a few months ago at the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce's annual breakfast, and he expressed an eagerness and a desire to work with students, and he's an all-around great guy, and has, like I had mentioned just before, a unique insight into the current and future healthcare industry. So I want to make sure that you guys all had an opportunity to meet him. So Kyle, please, by all means, take it away. Welcome to the Career Cafe.
Thank you. Certainly appreciate it. And happy to, come out here and certainly like to help. And since we've got a nice little intimate group, I can answer all of the questions you guys may want. And certainly for all the viewers at home, if you will, certainly happy to answer follow-up questions and, want to be as helpful as I can. I think one of the things that might be helpful is just kind of understand who I am and where I came from and my background and how I got to where I am today. Because I am a new resident of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in the last year. The genesis of that was I work for a company, as Troy said, that it's called American Academic Health System. I am the VP of Finance and M&A, which really is a generic title, if you will. I do a lot of things. I'm kind of a jack of all trade, but my main role was helping acquire two hospitals in Philadelphia, which is the reason I moved here, which is Hahnemann University Hospital and St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, which are, Hahnemann is right in the heart of Philadelphia, and St. Christopher's is kind of north in North Philadelphia. And so our company ended up buying those two hospitals almost exactly a year ago. Since then, I've been helping manage and run them. I work directly for the CEO of the entire business. We're, an $800 million revenue hospital system, so it is quite large and quite complex. Hospitals, as you can probably imagine, are extremely complicated, both from an operational standpoint, a financial standpoint, and just generally speaking, a hospital is kind of like a giant factory where you don't know what you're going to make. Because someone's going to walk in the door and you're not going to know what ails them and how to fix what is, the problem they're encountering. And then you have, thousands of people that, have to work in this whole system, and everything has to start connecting to each other, and people need to communicate well, and IT systems need to talk to other IT systems. And so it becomes, in my opinion, one of the most complicated industries that I've ever looked at. Which is one area where I find that fascinating, because every day is a challenge. Every single thing that we deal with is a challenge. And also, add the layer on top of that is that, Hahnemann itself is just, in a sense, kind of a turnaround hospital. It's not struggling massively, but it's one where it could be doing a lot better. And part of our specialty and what our company does is we know how to fix things that are broken systematically. And so our role has been one that's been fraught with challenges, and we're getting through it. And it's one where that to me is more fun than anything else, because if everything were working smoothly, I probably wouldn't really have a job, because I wouldn't be needed. That wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but we're getting to that point, and then we'll find something else that we can, fix. So to give you a little background of, I guess first off, I'll ask the question: do you even are you familiar with what mergers and acquisitions even kind of is or does? And if the answer is no, that's not a problem. When I was your age, I had zero idea. So in its simplest form, if you call, mergers and acquisitions, as the title would allude to, is either buying or merging two companies. But that's a very complicated process, because imagine buying a house, which is not easy, but not super complicated, but then you add tons of different layers to that, and how is the company performing, and where is the company going, and what are you going to do with it, and how are you going to buy it? Because it's not as simple as saying, this house is worth $100,000, I'm going to put a $20,000 down payment, and I'm going to get a mortgage for $80,000, and there we go, I'm going to be a homeowner. Even that's more complicated than I just made it. So buying a company also has all these complicated challenges from an ownership standpoint. Just transferring the ownership from one legal entity to another is a really complicated process. And there's a lot of risk involved in it, because if someone's selling you a house, you don't know if the plumbing's bad, you don't know how well they've kept it up. Companies kind of like that in a sense. You don't really know all of the inner workings and how good or bad it may be. And the seller on the other side of the table is going to try to make it look as best as possible because they want you to pay the top dollar for it. And you as a buyer need to be prudent in the sense of not overpaying for something and not stepping into a scenario that is untenable, or buying a company for more than you should have, because then you'd be struggling from the standpoint of, will your investment pay off? So it's a complicated and fascinating line of work, which I kind of fell into, if you will, but one that I think aligns with my skill set, because it's one where it's a giant puzzle. So if you like fixing things or you like solving problems, the fun aspect of kind of finance and mergers and acquisitions is that there's no one right answer. And so you're trying to find the best solution in a number of potential outcomes. So it's kind of like a poker game without finite odds. You don't know what cards the other person has, but that doesn't mean that there's a rigid set of probabilities that say this person's going to win this hand 5 times out of 10. You can say, okay, well, I know how I can make this particular company better, and this guy doesn't know how to do that, so therefore I'm going to be able to make this investment and I'm going to have it pay off better than what they can do. And then you have external factors, like I work in healthcare, so healthcare policy is something that's constantly changing. It changes administration to administration, city to city, district to district, state to state. A hospital is not like making widgets in the sense that we don't have someone paying us $5 a widget and these are my customers. Hospital gets reimbursed from state, local, federal, private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid. There are other outlets where you get reimbursed and paid for the services you provide as a hospital. And those are subject to political whims, they're subject to budget constraints in certain cases, and they're also subject to how well you can bill your customers in a sense, because healthcare isn't as easy as saying you walked into a hospital, here's your bill for $1,000. It's a very complicated process, and if you've unfortunately been to the hospital, as even I have, they're impossible to figure out. And so doing all of those things and making all of those pieces fit is what, from a kind of finance and a operational finance role, that's what makes it really difficult and challenging. So that's one area where I think people who enjoy finance, like me, that's the reason you kind of get into it. And ultimately, anything that you do career-wise, you really should enjoy it. You never want to do anything just because the paycheck is good, because ultimately you're going to burn out. There are plenty of things in the world where you can, make a lot of money if that is your end goal, but doing something that you enjoy. I happen to enjoy healthcare because it's something that affects all of us. It's something that no matter who you are, where you grew up, or how much money you have or don't have, healthcare is going to affect your life, because there's only, the two inevitabilities in life, death and taxes. Well, healthcare is related to that, and you're going to have to seek healthcare at some point in your life. And for me, it's one where we operate hospitals that treat underserved patients. So we pride ourselves in the fact that if you go into the neighborhoods where Hahnemann and St. Christopher's are, they're really challenged neighborhoods. The poverty rate is extremely high. The median income is very low. And so these are the people who need our services more so than anyone else. And so part of the stress of my job is making sure we do that as efficiently as possible, because we are, as the saying goes in health, we're the safety net. If our hospitals went away, a lot of people would suffer. So it's one of those things where we take pride in it, and it's also a lot of responsibility. because it's one where we can't do things to not be sustainable. We can't do things that aren't going to be to the benefit of our patients. So any meeting that we have, anything that we do, any decision we have, patients come first. We have to do things in a sustainable way, both financially and operationally, but you can't do anything to harm patients. And so, that's a unique thing in our industry, at least from a hospital standpoint, because if a manufacturer goes out of business, it's not good, but people's lives aren't on the line. People's livelihoods are on the line. It's frictional costs. It's going to be problematic. No one likes to see any kind of bankruptcies, but with healthcare providers specifically, there's more of an impetus to be very careful and cognizant and mindful of what you're doing. So that's kind of how I ended up in healthcare. It's also just something that over my career, and I'll get to that in a second, it's just always been something where I've gone back and forth in and out of healthcare, just because it's always been something that's been of interest to me, and I like it. There are plenty of things out there. I have a lot of friends who ended up working for like Google and Facebook and all those companies, and I'm sure it's fascinating, but it doesn't interest me. So, when you look for your kind of career path and where you want to go, find something that does have an interest to you. It took me probably 7-8 years post high school even to figure out potentially where I'd want to spend my career. And I kind of fell into finance and healthcare finance because they were both things that were of interest to me, and I ended up finding a way to integrate those two together. And and to be honest, I fell into it. And it's something where I got introduced to the right people and worked a few jobs where it was healthcare related, worked a few jobs that were finance related, and then all of a sudden found a job where I got to blend the two of those things together. And so you'll find things where if you read books and articles about different careers and different things that you could do, even entry-level jobs can be really fascinating because you'll learn a lot. My biggest advice when you start looking for career opportunities and paths, post-college, post-high school, find places where you can learn the most. All else being equal, take the job where you're going to learn more, even if it pays you a little bit less, because that's going to be your foundation for what you can build on. So I was fortunate. I fell into a job post-college where I got to learn a ton. I wasn't paid terribly, but it wasn't going to be a career for me for the rest of my life. I started out working at an insurance broker post-college, but I got to do a very unique role there where I was advising companies on the acquisitions they were making to buy other companies. So I got to see all these different unique companies and understand the risks they were taking, how they operated. And by doing that for, I think it was 3 or 4 years, I got to see probably 300 different companies and understand how they work. And that's unique in the sense that I didn't know half the companies that existed there. I wouldn't have known what they did or even heard of them because there were a lot of back office services. Some of them were manufacturing companies and things that you would have never heard of. But I got to learn about all of that. And I took that learning and I ended up going to business school after that. I went to the University of Michigan. So go blue for anyone out there who likes Michigan. I know we're in Pennsylvania, so at least we're probably closer to a Penn State country, which you guys have beat us in football plenty of times. So, from there I ended up kind of finding my career path to get to healthcare through first consulting. Worked for a consulting firm called LEK. Had a bunch of healthcare clients, had a bunch of clients who were private equity funds who were buying companies, some in healthcare, some not. And after that, I decided I really want to actually be on the kind of investing side. I want to finally try my hand at being able to buy a company. And I worked with a friend of mine who had raised a small investment fund, and we bought a company. It was a logistics company. And so it short version of what this company does is fairly unique, and this is where you learn about these random companies, is we bought a company that has racks that they make and they use those racks and they rent them to flower growers who then put the flowers on these racks, throw them on semi-trucks, and deliver them to Home Depot and Lowe's around the country. And then the company that we bought, they're the ones who rent those racks to those customers and then goes and picks them up across 8,000 points across the country, pulls them all back together, and then rents them back to their customers. Random business model. Random thing that I would never even known existed. But that's part of the fun of finance and the area of finance that I was working in, where these are companies that you're never going to see day to day. Until I saw that company, if you had asked me, how do you think flowers are shipped to Home Depot? I would have been like, I have no idea. That's a unique question, but there's a company out there that does all of those things. And there's examples of this all across the country with any kind of company that's out there. And so that's part of the fun of working in finance, is you see all these things that aren't necessarily tangible right in front of you, like someone made that chair. Okay, well, how was that chair, manufactured, distributed, sold, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the areas where I think it's fun if you're interested in the things that the questions of how is this done and why is it done that way? That's one of the areas where I don't think people understand that finance isn't just numbers and how do you buy a company and how do you finance it. There's all these other areas where it kind of touches on a number of things, which is why people really like being in finance in general. But it's not for everybody. That just happens to be my thing, is figuring out problems that exist, how do you fix them, and finance gets to wrap all of that together. And math was never something that I was scared of, so that has a component to it because you got to run a few numbers here and there. And so from buying that company and kind of moving on, doing some other jobs, I ended up randomly working in an environmental services company doing all of their M&A. So I bought 3 companies for this company over a year and a half and integrated the different things that we were buying. And what we were trying to do was what's called vertical integration, which is if we did XYZ service, but we had to hire someone to do a piece of it, we went and bought that company so that we could do the whole service all in-house. And so when we went to our customers and said, hey, this is a company that happened to do what's called trucking and disposals for waste management for oil and gas companies. So we can say, okay, we can haul the waste that you're generating from pulling oil out of the ground and we can dispose of it. Before we could only say, oh, well, we can only truck it and you let us know where we want to dispose it and we'll go find it. So we did that for a while. Interesting company. It wasn't necessarily an industry I wanted to stay in. And then I got introduced to my current boss about 3 years ago, who was a hospital CEO. He ran a 4-hospital system in Los Angeles. He had bought it and turned it around, and he wanted to hire someone to help him acquire more companies. And so that's certainly in my background. And so started working for him. Had never looked at hospital financials in my life before. Started learning about it. Found it even more interesting. Have done other healthcare stuff. And lo and behold, here we are 3 years later, and we had acquired these 2 hospitals a year ago and are running them now. So it becomes a lot of fun because my job is never the same. Some days I wake up and I have no idea what's going to happen and what fires I'm going to have to put out and what operational issues we're going to have, what successes we're going to have. And so to me, I don't like being in a box. I don't like being in one lane and saying, here's my job. This is where my job starts. This is where my job ends. I like having the latitude. And that's not for everybody, but that's how I operate. And I'm kind of sporadic and ADD. And so, being able to do 5 different things at once is kind of my MO. And so it's one where I like that work environment. So, that's kind of how I got to where I, started. And, I grew up in Los Angeles. So certainly it's a different environment in the East Coast. And I've lived all in the Midwest and I've lived on the East Coast before. But, I've certainly come to love, Philly. And I certainly, really enjoy my job, even with all the stresses that it entails, because, I got a lot of responsibility on my plate. But it's certainly quite fun. So, with that's kind of who I am and where I came from. But, one of the things I want to kind of impart on you guys a few, pearls of wisdom, if you will, since, probably, I'm 35 years old, so at one point I was sitting in your seat and not knowing what I wanted to do with my life and where to go. So a couple pieces of advice that I would impart on you. So when you're working in a job, you're gonna start somewhere. It's gonna be entry level. That's fine. Learn as much as you can, work as hard as you can. And I know there's a million cliches out there that some of them ring true, but some of the counterintuitive advice that I would give to you is when you're working in a job, find a way to make your job obsolete. And I know that sounds weird, but if you can find a way to make your job almost easy and automated, you become more valuable than someone who has to do, everything themselves. And I'll give you an example. So when I was at the environmental services company, I got I got asked to be the controller because our controller quit. And I was the only guy who was there who knew how to do that job. So you're gonna be controller for a little while until we hire a new one. Okay. The former controller would put together these reports and he would do things in Excel, but he would do them really manually and it would take him 2 days, and it would be one of these things where people would be like, hey, I need this from you, can you get it to me? And he'd be like, oh, I'll get to it next week. So I took a look at it, said, okay, there's a few ways we can just completely automate this. And so I took 2 hours, 3 hours in Excel and I built a couple of algorithms and formulas, and all of a sudden I could drop in a set of the current month's data and the report would spit out automatically, and I gave it right to the team who needed it, and they never had to ask me for another thing after that. And so what they were used to was waiting for this guy to give them a report a week later and having to wait every time, to me giving them a simple tool that allowed them to do whatever they needed at any point in time they wanted. And so I didn't have to spend any more time on it. They didn't have to wait. They didn't have to spend any time asking this guy for a report. And that allowed me to do other things. So by making my job obsolete in that case, I became more valuable. And most people intuitively think the opposite. Oh, if I'm the only one who knows how to do it, I'm more valuable. But it's the concept of, teach a man to fish and he'll be able to eat for a lifetime. But if you give him a fish, he'll be hungry in the next day, right? So that's one piece of advice where when you're doing any job, try to find a way to make it more efficient. And if you can make it automated, great. You can then do that 5 times over and you'll be the most valuable employee at that company. So, that's one where most people wouldn't think that way. And certainly I didn't think that way until I started kind of seeing it in practice. Another piece of advice would be, as you search for a career and a career path, talk to as many people along the way. Right? Find people who are working in those jobs and say, what do you like about your job? What keeps you up at night? What do you dislike about your job? It doesn't have to be, the CEO. It could be the person where hey, this is the analyst at XYZ company. Is that something that you like? Is that job description and the way they describe it something that resonates with you? And the other piece of advice with that is when you talk to people, because especially a lot of times when you go and find these people and have a conversation with them and see if you can schedule a phone call or just meet them for coffee. The other piece of advice is always ask them for advice. Don't ask them for a job. If you ask someone for a job, you're going to get advice. If you ask someone for advice, you will get a job. Because one, it's just the way things end up happening. But two, if you're asking for someone for advice, they're generally going to want to help you. And if you're asking them for advice, you're 99% of the time, unless you're faking it, genuinely interested in hearing what they have to say and getting their advice and accepting it and using it. And most people who are in that kind of mindset are the ones that people want to work with because they're fixers, they want to help, they want to do things, they want to be productive. But if I just came to you and say, hey, can you give me a job? At first glance, would be like, well, I don't know. And so I'm already on my heels if you kind of come with that mentality of well, I'm looking for a job. Well, I'm looking for advice. As the conversation flows, I say, hey, this person's really smart. This person seems really interested. They know about the company that I work for, and hey, I happen to be in a position to hire. Perfect. You fit the bill. Why don't you give me your resume and I'll pass it off to HR. I have actually gotten jobs that way. No joke. So that's a huge piece of advice that I think people don't realize or recognize. That is one that will help you take all of those steps throughout your career to get to the place that you want to be. The other piece of advice in general that I like to give, because most people of your age, of any age, when they're first starting out in their career, your resumes are going to be terrible. And they don't have to be, is the point. So, I've had to review thousands and thousands and thousands of resumes. And in all honesty, 90% of them are not very good. And it's not your fault, it's just most of the time people don't take the time to think through it, they don't get the right advice from people, and they don't seek out, someone to tell them, hey, here's how to make your resume better. And there's a couple of key examples. And so at Michigan, we had a saying that's called ACR, Action, Context, Result. And so your resume should really only be 10 to 15% action, 15 to 25%, context, and the rest should be result-driven. So to give you some examples, most people's resumes say, responsible for this, my task was doing this, I was in charge of this. So those statements are just the action. I did X, Y, and Z. I don't know how important that is. That's the context. So if you were responsible for doing X, Y, Z, whether it's I was responsible for putting on, the presentation to, the board. Well, is this important? Is it not? How many people is that? How important were the decisions? How is it quantified? And then when you get to the results, you want to say, okay, if I was in charge of doing X, Y, and Z, what became of that? And as much as you can quantify it, the better. To say, hey, I put in place a process that shaved wait times for people calling in for questions by 8%. If I know the action that you did to do that, the context of why that's important, and the quantifiable result, I get the full picture on your resume to say, okay, this person followed through with something that had a tangible benefit, and here's how much that benefit happened to whatever company, whatever project. And so the other challenge that I know you guys will face in the sense that you haven't worked that many jobs. You might work part-time, you probably could be student government, could be in different clubs and whatnot, but you can use different things and frame it still in that ACR format to show the relative importance. And one of my favorite examples, I was helping a kid with his resume, and his summer job was being a lifeguard at the local pool. Awesome job. I envy the fact that he can probably sit there and get tan and not have to do really anything because it's a 5-foot pool and it was just someone there to be, safety, right? But the thing is, when I started talking to him about it, he was actually asked to be the lifeguard trainer. He was the one who trained other new lifeguards who started every year because he was a responsible kid and he was, a leader. And so someone, even in an easy job, asked him to take on more responsibility. That's huge. Even if it's an easy job, you were picked out of everyone else to take on more responsibility. So even though I would arguably love to switch jobs with him because it's fun to sit by a pool all day, that shows me if I was reading his resume, hey, this person, even in an easy job, steps up. They do more. They were more responsible than everybody else. They were given extra responsibility because of it. So those are plenty of things where you can highlight even part-time jobs, even being a barback, even being a barista, even being a busboy, anything you can do. No one's going to fault you for needing to make some cash along the way, right? You're trying to get to your career. Everyone's worked jobs. I was a server. I worked at a gym at one point. I did delivery for restaurants. I've done all of those kind of jobs, but you want to find ways to show that something you were doing there was different than just the fact that you were working a task every day just to make a paycheck. So, I would find things like that you can put on your resume, and along the way, your resume is just going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And so then at some point, I don't have anything on my resume of the part-time jobs I worked in college because that was 15 years ago. But certainly when I didn't have any career and I didn't have a full-time job, those were all on my resume. They had to be. I had to say, hey, here's what I've been doing. So, as you do that, and you start taking on some of these roles, whether it's a part-time job, whether it's a club, find those things as you think about building your resume so that you can put those bullets on there. So that then when someone like me looks at your resume, I've got a clear enough picture that I know what you're doing, I know how important it was, and I know what the result was. And then the last piece of that is you give me not quite enough information. You make it so that every bullet on your resume warrants a question. And you want everything on your resume to have a good story with it. So you look at a bullet on your resume, you say, what is the story behind this? Because that's where you get to showcase who you are ultimately when you're in an interview or a phone interview, whatever it is. So when I look at it, it's like, I know enough about this, but I do have a follow-up question. And you're going to be able to say, oh, well, here's the whole story, and this is what we were doing, and this is why it was so important, and here was my role, and that's where you get to showcase you. Last piece of advice I have on a resume is always put something personal in a sense, so that you get a flavor of who you are. And there's always like an other section. So to give you an example, my other section in my resume is I speak Spanish fluently, just coincidentally, so that's just a good place to like put an extra skill that has no other place in my resume because I didn't like work in another country that's Spanish speaking. And then the other two kind of more personal ones are like I'm an amateur DJ because I like to, I've always loved music, and so I do that as a hobby. And then I have a lifetime goal of snowboarding every continent possible in the world, and I've hit 2 of them so far. Need to get a little further in that goal, but those are things that warrant conversations, and that's where like no matter what in an interview, you want to see what someone is like because you're going to have to be working 8 to 12 hours a day with this person. You want to know that like, okay, they can do the job, but like, do I get along with this person? Culture is important, right? Building a team is important, and having the pieces of that fit together is also important. So that's where, at least in consulting, you call it the airplane test. Can I sit next to this person on a plane for 6 hours and not like, be just like praying for it to, plane to land and get off the plane, right? So that's where when you have all those sections in your resume, it's nice because then you can have something to talk about, and you want to make it not so hyper specific and unique that like it's not relatable, because then I don't really know about it and I'm going to struggle to have questions and have a conversation with it. But you also don't want to make it so generic that like, for example, I've seen a bunch of them where people say like avid runner. There's nothing wrong with running. I personally don't like it because I find it boring, but I don't know if you're just like, hey, I casually run, or if you're like a serious marathoner. So if you wrote on your resume like qualified for the Boston Marathon, even as someone who doesn't like to run, I know that's really difficult, and props to you if you can do that. And so that's where you want to find that balance on a resume that's engaging enough to anyone who just kind of has a general sense of knowledge on random topics, but unique enough to you that's like something you can talk about because it's a hobby of yours, a passion of yours. If you play music, everyone loves music in some sense. You're like, hey, I'm a classically trained pianist. Great. Cool. What can you play? Have you played in front of anyone? You played in an auditorium. You do that with like a band. That's an area where you can like talk about that stuff, and people will like relate to you personally, which also helps ultimately when you want to get hired because people want to relate to you and know that you can credibly do the job. So, with that, I want to make sure I leave enough time for you guys to ask questions. So if you have questions, I'd love to answer and help you guys out.
So you talked about how you kind of fell into this role and within the professional realm, talked about your journey there. What about through your educational experiences? What kind of things did you do maybe in college? Like you talked about at jobs, differentiating yourself. What kind of things did you do?
So kind of for me, and candidly, my GPA was not very good in college. One thing I definitely do not recommend is taking my path on that one because it has only made my life harder. Grades do matter because ultimately it's a quantifiable thing that you can be measured against. So, certainly don't take my path in that sense. But in college, I was fairly involved in the sense that, I was in a fraternity. I went to UC Davis, which was in Northern California, and it's a big school but a small community. So it's kind of one of those like college towns, and I was as involved as I could be. So I took leadership roles in my fraternity. There was an interfraternity council. I ended up becoming president of that. And fortunately, things that I did along the way, I think really helped. And I was able to quantify those to show, like I said, from a resume standpoint, we had a situation that I walked into, at least when I started in the interfraternity council. I was on the board for 2 years, president for the last year. We were losing our recruitment to where the school was down to, I think, like 8% were involved in the Greek system. And for a campus of 30,000 undergrads, just under, that was the lowest point it had been in the last, I think, decade at that point. And so I purposely did several initiatives to improve recruitment, to make, certain fraternities were kind of fighting with each other, and I, fortunately was able to get through to them to kind of stop that because it didn't help anyone's recruiting. We organized more inclusive events for the campus, and ultimately, after 2 years of being on the board, we went from 8% to 10% in 2 years, which, when you have 30,000 undergrads, that's actually a pretty significant increase. So that's one thing where having that involvement, having that impact, being able to quantify it, and being able to talk about it in hindsight, but also learning how to do it along the way was, I think, more important than some of the schoolwork I did, to be honest. And I found similar things when I went to business school, where business school has great academic focused program, but it's really the quasi-academic pieces that are more important to learn, because you get, a lot of the top business schools have really cool programs where, like, you can, go into a crisis management situation and you can learn how to deal with issues in a very safe and, easy environment to where you make the mistakes and not have them have real tangible impacts, because you're doing it in a hypothetical scenario. But that's where those kind of experiences are the ones that I've leaned on in my professional life, more so than any class I took that said, hey, here's how, finance works, and here's how, you can, be a better manager, so to speak. Those are the things that don't really help, but what you have to learn from college, anywhere you go, and even in high school, you learn how to learn. It doesn't matter if I know chemistry or biology to this day, because it doesn't have any impact in my daily life and my job, but knowing how to learn a new thing is always going to be important, because at no point in my career do I ever want to be in a position where I'm not still learning. At that point, I probably should retire and then go play golf. And even then, I'm never going to play golf very well, so I'm going to have to learn that too. But that's, that's where I think I've learned more from academic settings in the things that weren't directly involved in academia.
Thank you.
You spoke about moving over here and your both professional and personal growth. And I'm curious, because we talk with the students a lot about balance and living a rounded life. How do you do that?
That is the $1 million question. I think that's one where everyone has to find their own balance to life. And I wouldn't say I'm a workaholic or a self-imposed one. It's more that when I find something that I really enjoy, I don't half-ass it. And so I've worked jobs and careers where, like, I didn't enjoy it for one reason or the other. And so your heart isn't really in it. And you can't do any career that's going to be time consuming. And ultimately, if you're doing a career that is, either lucrative on the one hand or gives you a ton of responsibility, whether it's, a nonprofit that's serving a great mission, you can't pour your life out for something that like you don't have the interest in, because that will drive a wedge in how the quality of work, how much you enjoy it, and that's going to show. And it's also just not going to be the quality of life you want, because you'll be either, living your life because your parent wanted you to be a doctor and you're going to hate it. Don't do that. You can make a great impact working at a nonprofit, doing something you love, or you can do something. I happen to like finance, and finance happens to pay pretty well. So fortunately, I don't have to worry entirely about, whether or not I can, buy my next meal and pay the rent, but I also happen to really like what I do. It just happens to be in an industry that pays a little bit better than average. But if it didn't pay better than average, I would still do it, because I like my job. And so you want to find something that allows you to do that, and then also one that aligns with how much or how little you want to work. Unfortunately, I have really, supportive family, and, I do work pretty long hours, but I find ways to enjoy my time away from the office and away from doing that kind of stuff. But sometimes it's still in my head. It's of interest to me enough, and it's important to me enough that, on the weekends, I still think about things that we need to do for work. So the balance, I think, is, and to the crux of your question, is that's dependent on who you are and what you want. And so don't lie to yourself for the things you do or do not want with that, because ultimately you're not going to fake it for anyone else, because it's who you are. If you want a 9 to 5 and you want to shut off when you get home from work, do it. If that makes you happy, then by all means, find a career and find a place that allows you to do that. That's just not me. I don't mind working until 7 p.m. when it's something that I know has a tangible impact and something that will make a difference. I'll put in that extra hour because I know it has something that will be beneficial.
Well, thank you so much for doing the exigencies of a working high school.
Okay, we got some exit music, so thank you.